The dust hadn't settled from the stagecoach wheels before Naomi Carson noticed the way her hands trembled as she unfolded the telegram that had been waiting at the Jerome, Arizona post office. And by the time she'd read the first 3 words, her vision blurred so badly she could barely make out the rest of the message that would change everything she thought she knew about her future. It was August 1882, and the copper mining town perched on Mingus Mountain blazed under an unforgiving sun that turned the red rocks into something that looked like the surface of hell itself. Naomi had arrived only 2 months prior, traveling from Boston to take up a position as schoolteacher after answering an advertisement that promised good pay and respectable lodging. What it hadn't promised was the isolation, the rough company, or the letters from home that came less and less frequently until this one arrived with news that made her wish it had never come at all. Her father was dead. The consumption that had plagued him for years had finally taken him in the night, alone, because her mother had passed the previous winter. The family home was being sold to cover debts Naomi hadn't known existed, and her younger brother Thomas had already left for California with what little remained. There was nothing to come home to, the letter explained in her aunt's crisp handwriting, and it would be best if Naomi stayed where she was and made a life in the West because there was simply nothing left for her in Massachusetts. She stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the post office, the letter gripped so tightly in her fingers that the paper began to tear at the creases. The main street of Jerome stretched before her, a chaos of saloons and supply stores and men covered in copper dust staggering between shifts at the mines that honeycombed the mountain beneath their feet. Someone shouted something crude from across the street, and a piano jangled out of tune from the Lucky Strike saloon. The whole town felt like it was sliding down the mountain, buildings propped at odd angles, nothing permanent, nothing certain. Naomi's chest constricted, and she pressed one hand against the weathered wood of the post office wall to steady herself. She'd been so alone here already, teaching children who showed up to class maybe half the time, living in a tiny room above the general store, eating meals by herself while the rough sounds of the mining town echoed through her window at all hours. She'd told herself it was temporary, that she was building something, saving money to eventually go home. But home didn't exist anymore. The tears came hot and fast, blurring the already difficult handwriting on the telegram. She tried to stop them, tried to maintain the composure that had been drilled into her since childhood, but her shoulders shook with the effort of containing grief that felt too large for her body. She was 23 years old and utterly, completely alone in the world. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching, didn't notice anyone nearby until a shadow fell across her and a quiet voice said, "Madam, are you all right?" Naomi looked up through her tears at a man she'd seen around town but never spoken to. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate sparingly, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green. He wore dusty clothes that marked him as a cowboy rather than a miner, his hat pushed back on his head, and his expression held genuine concern without the leering quality she'd learned to expect from most men in Jerome. "I'm fine," she managed to say, which was such an obvious lie that she almost laughed at herself for trying. She turned away, trying to hide her face, trying to fold the letter and compose herself. The cowboy didn't leave. He stood there quietly for a moment, then said, "Doesn't look like fine from where I'm standing." Naomi drew in a shuddering breath. "It's nothing that concerns you, sir. Please, I just need a moment." But her voice broke on the last word, and a fresh wave of tears threatened to overwhelm her completely. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, mortified to be falling apart in the middle of town, in front of a stranger, when she prided herself on her strength and independence. "Here," the cowboy said gently. "Come on. You don't want to be standing out here like this." Before she could protest, he'd placed a hand very carefully on her elbow and was guiding her away from the main street, down a narrow path between buildings to where a few cottonwood trees provided blessed shade and a measure of privacy. Naomi knew she should resist, should insist on her ability to handle herself, but her legs felt weak and her head was spinning, and the kindness in his touch undid something in her chest that had been wound too tight for too long. When they reached the shade, she expected him to ask what was wrong, to demand an explanation or try to read the letter she still clutched in her hand. Instead, he simply said, "Sit down before you fall down." There was a wooden bench someone had built beneath the cottonwoods, probably for miners seeking relief from the relentless sun. Naomi sank onto it, and the cowboy sat beside her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the solid presence of another human being. She waited for the questions, for the intrusion, but he just sat there, patient and quiet. That silence, that unexpected respect for her privacy broke something open inside her. The sobs came harder, wrenching through her whole body, and she couldn't stop them, couldn't control them. She bent forward, the letter falling from her hands to the dusty ground, and covered her face with both hands as she cried for her father, for her mother, for the home that no longer existed, for the family she'd never see again, for the loneliness that stretched ahead of her like the Arizona desert, endless and unforgiving. She felt the cowboy shift beside her, and then his arm came around her shoulder, solid and warm. He pulled her against his side, and she should have pulled away, should have maintained propriety, but she was drowning in grief, and his presence felt like the only solid thing in a world that had just proven itself to be built on sand. She turned into his chest and cried like she hadn't cried since she was a child. Great gasping sobs that hurt her throat and made her head ache. He held her through all of it. His hand rubbed slow circles on her back, and he murmured things she couldn't quite make out, soothing sounds that didn't require understanding. He smelled like leather and sage and horse, and his shirt was rough cotton against her cheek, and none of it should have been comforting, but somehow it was. He didn't ask what the letter said. He didn't push for explanations. He just held her and let her fall apart. Time became strange in that shaded space beneath the cottonwoods. It might have been 10 minutes or an hour before Naomi's tears finally slowed, before the sobs turned to hiccups and then to shaky breaths. She became aware of how she must look, her face pressed against a stranger's chest, her hair falling out of its pins, her eyes surely red and swollen. Embarrassment flooded through her, and she pulled back quickly. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice hoarse. "I don't know what came over me. I'm not usually so. I apologize for falling apart like that." The cowboy's arm dropped away from her shoulders, but his expression remained kind. "Nothing to apologize for. Sometimes life hands us more than we can carry alone." Naomi looked down at her hands, at the dust smudges on her dark blue dress, anywhere but at him. "You must think me terribly weak." "I think you're hurting," he said simply. "That's not weakness. That's being human." She did look at him then, really look at him for the first time. His face was weathered by sun and wind, probably in his late 20s, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, even if he wasn't smiling now. There was something steady about him, something that made her feel like she could trust him even though she didn't know his name. "I'm Naomi Carson," she said, because it seemed important to establish at least that much. "The school teacher." "I know," he said. "I've seen you around town. I'm Dalton Steele. I work at the Double R Ranch down in the valley." "What were you doing in town?" "Picking up supplies." He gestured vaguely back toward the main street. "Saw you on the boardwalk and, well, you looked like you could use a friend." Naomi's throat tightened again, but she forced the tears back. "I don't have many of those here. Friends, I mean, or anywhere else, anymore." Dalton didn't press for details, though she could see the curiosity in his eyes. Instead, he said, "Jerome's a hard town to be alone in, especially for a woman, especially for someone like you." "Someone like me?" "Someone educated, someone with refinement, someone who probably came from somewhere a lot different than this." He looked around at the rough mining town visible through the cottonwood branches. This place chews people up if they're not careful. "I'm beginning to realize that," Naomi said quietly. She looked down and saw the letter on the ground, partially covered in dust. The sight of it made her chest ache again, but she bent to pick it up, folding it carefully and tucking it into her pocket. When she looked back up, Dalton was watching her with an expression that held no demands, just patience. "Thank you," she said, "for your kindness. I should get back. I have lessons to prepare for tomorrow." "Will you be all right?" Dalton asked, standing when she did. Naomi considered lying, but something about him invited honesty. "I don't know, but I'll manage. I always do." "That's not the same as being all right." "No," she agreed, "it's not, but it's all I have right now." Dalton was quiet for a moment, then said, "I come into town most Saturdays for supplies. If you ever need anything, someone to talk to, or just someone to sit with you so you're not alone, you can usually find me at the general store around mid-morning." It was such a simple offer, but it made something warm bloom in Naomi's chest despite her grief. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." "Maybe that's reason enough to try," Dalton said. "Besides, I know what it's like to be alone in a place that doesn't feel like home." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat to her and started back toward the main street, leaving her standing beneath the cottonwoods with tears drying on her cheeks and the first small seed of something that might eventually become hope taking root somewhere deep inside her sorrow. The next days passed in a haze of grief and routine. Naomi taught her classes, corrected papers, prepared lessons, all while feeling like she was moving through water. She lay awake at night in her small room listening to the sounds of the mining town and feeling the weight of her aloneness pressing down on her like a physical thing. The letter stayed in her pocket during the day and under her pillow at night, a constant reminder of everything she'd lost. She found herself thinking about Dalton Steele more than she probably should have. The way he'd held her without asking for anything in return, the steadiness of his presence, the offer of friendship that had seemed genuine rather than opportunistic. Jerome was full of men who would happily take advantage of a woman alone, but something about Dalton had felt different, safe. Saturday came, and Naomi woke with a strange nervousness fluttering in her stomach. She told herself she had errands to run anyway, that she would have gone to the general store regardless of whether Dalton might be there. She changed her dress 3 times before settling on a simple gray cotton that was practical but becoming, then felt ridiculous for caring. She wasn't going to meet him. She was just going about her business. If they happened to encounter each other, well, that would be a coincidence. The general store occupied the ground floor of the building where she rented her room, which meant she couldn't avoid walking past it even if she wanted to. She descended the outside stairs at mid-morning, her shopping basket over her arm, and pushed through the door into the dimness of the store with her heart beating faster than it should have been. The owner, Mr. Patterson, greeted her from behind the counter where he was measuring out sugar for another customer. Naomi began browsing the shelves, picking up items she needed, thread and soap and flour, while her eyes scanned the store for a tall cowboy with gray-green eyes. He wasn't there. The disappointment that washed over her was entirely disproportionate to the situation, and she scolded herself for it. He'd said he usually came to town on Saturdays, not that he'd definitely be here this particular Saturday. And even if he had been here, what had she expected? That they'd become instant friends, that he'd solve all her problems? She was being foolish. She was paying for her purchases when the door opened and Dalton walked in, and the way her heart jumped was absolutely ridiculous. He saw her immediately and smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. "Miss Carson," he said, approaching the counter. "Good morning." "Mr. Steele," she replied, hoping her voice sounded normal. "How are you?" "Can't complain. How are you holding up?" The question was quiet enough that Mr. Patterson couldn't hear it over the sound of the coins he was counting into his cash box. Naomi appreciated the discretion. "Better," she said, which was partially true. "Thank you again for your kindness last Saturday." "No thanks needed." Dalton glanced at Mr. Patterson, then back to her. "I was about to get some breakfast over at the cafe. Would you care to join me, unless you've already eaten?" Naomi had eaten, a piece of bread and some cheese in her room hours ago, but she found herself saying, "I could use some coffee." The cafe was a small establishment run by a Mexican woman named Mrs. Alvarez, who served the best food in Jerome from a kitchen barely bigger than a closet. Most of the miners avoided it because it was too expensive and too clean for their tastes, which meant it was one of the few places in town where Naomi felt relatively comfortable. She and Dalton found a table by the window, and Mrs. Alvarez brought them coffee without being asked. "You look tired," Dalton observed once they were seated. "Are you sleeping?" "Not very well," Naomi admitted. There was something about his directness that made it easy to be honest. "I keep thinking about everything that's changed." "Do you want to talk about it?" Part of her did desperately, but another part was afraid that if she started talking, she'd fall apart again. "The letter," she began hesitantly. "It was from my aunt in Boston. My father passed away, and before that, my mother. The family home is gone, sold for debts. My brother has gone to California. There's nothing left of the life I had before I came here." Dalton's expression sobered. "I'm sorry. That's a lot to lose all at once." "The worst part is that I wasn't there," Naomi said, staring down at her coffee. "I was here, teaching children their letters while my father was dying alone. I thought I'd go back eventually, that this was temporary, but now there's nowhere to go back to." "So Jerome is home now, whether you want it to be or not." "I suppose it is." The thought was bleak. Not much of a home, though. "It could be," Dalton said, "if you let it, if you find the right people." Naomi looked up at him. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "I am?" He took a sip of his coffee. "I came out here from Texas 5 years ago after my family's ranch failed, lost everything in a drought. My parents moved in with my sister in San Antonio, but I wanted to start fresh, so I headed west. Ended up in Arizona working cattle for the Double R. Do you like it?" Dalton considered this. "It's different from what I knew. The land here is harder, drier. The work is good, though, and my boss is fair. I've made friends, built something of a life." He smiled slightly. "It's not what I imagined when I was growing up, but it's mine." "That's what I'm afraid of," Naomi confessed. "That this is all there is. Teaching in a rough mining town, living in a room above a store, alone." "You don't have to be alone," Dalton said. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Naomi felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean friends for starters," Dalton said easily, though there was something in his eyes that suggested he meant more than that. "You need people you can rely on out here. People who understand what it's like to be far from home. I'd like to be one of those people, if you'll let me." "Why?" Naomi asked again, the same question she'd asked last Saturday. "You barely know me." "I'd like to know you better," Dalton said simply. "You seem like someone worth knowing." Mrs. Alvarez appeared at that moment with plates of eggs and tortillas and fried potatoes, even though Dalton had only ordered coffee. She set them down with a knowing look and said, "You both too skinny. Eat." Dalton laughed and thanked her, and the moment of intensity passed, but Naomi felt something shift between them, some acknowledgement of possibility. They ate and talked about easier things, about the ranch where he worked, about the students she taught, about the peculiar character of Jerome perched on its mountain. Dalton was easy to talk to, asking questions that showed genuine interest, sharing stories that made her laugh for the first time in what felt like weeks. When they finished eating and stepped back out into the bright morning, Naomi felt lighter than she had since receiving the letter. Dalton walked with her back toward the general store, carrying her basket of purchases despite her protests. "Would you like to go riding tomorrow?" he asked as they reached her stairs. "It's Sunday. You won't have school, and I have the day off. I could show you some of the country around here, get you out of town for a bit." Naomi hesitated. It felt bold, perhaps even improper, to go riding alone with a man. But then again, she was alone in Arizona with no one to care about propriety, and the thought of spending another day trapped in her small room or walking the rough streets of Jerome made her want to cry. "I don't have a horse," she said. "The ranch has plenty. I'll bring an extra. We'll keep it respectable, I promise. Just some fresh air and different scenery." "All right," Naomi found herself saying. "Well, what time?" "Early, before it gets too hot. I'll meet you here at 7? 7, she agreed, and the smile he gave her made her stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with grief. Naomi spent the rest of Saturday in a strange state of anticipation and anxiety. She told herself it was just a ride, just two people becoming friends, nothing more. but she also found herself looking through her limited wardrobe for her riding skirt, pressing it carefully, making sure her boots were clean. She went to bed early and lay awake anyway, her mind spinning with thoughts of gray-green eyes and a gentle voice and strong arms holding her while she cried. Dalton arrived exactly at 7 on a big bay gelding, leading a smaller chestnut mare. Naomi came down the stairs in her riding clothes, her hair braided practically down her back, and the way his face brightened when he saw her made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, desired, noticed, valued. "Morning," he said. "This is Penny. She's gentle and smart. You'll get along fine." He helped her mount, his hands steadying her, his presence solid and reassuring. Then they were riding out of Jerome as the town slowly woke around them, heading down the mountain toward the Verde Valley spread out below in shades of green and brown and red. The morning air was cool, the heat of the day still hours away. They rode in comfortable silence at first, letting the horses pick their way down the rocky trail. When they reached the valley floor, Dalton led them along a creek lined with cottonwoods and willows, the sound of water a pleasant counterpoint to the dry landscape beyond. "It's beautiful," Naomi said, and meant it. From up in Jerome, the land had seemed harsh and unwelcoming, but down here she could see the subtler beauty of the desert, the way light played on red rocks, the surprising greenery along the waterways, the vast sky that seemed to go on forever. "There's a place I want to show you," Dalton said. "It's not far." He led her up a side canyon where the creek narrowed and deepened, the walls rising around them in layers of red and white stone. They rounded a bend, and Naomi gasped. A waterfall, small but lovely, spilled over smooth rocks into a clear pool surrounded by ferns and wildflowers. It felt like a secret place, hidden from the harshness of the surrounding desert. They dismounted and let the horses drink while they sat on a flat rock near the water. The sound of the falls was soothing, and the air felt cooler here, almost magical. "I found this place my first year in Arizona," Dalton said. "When I was feeling homesick and sorry for myself, it reminded me that there's beauty everywhere if you look for it, even in places that seem hard and unforgiving at first." "Thank you for bringing me here," Naomi said. She trailed her fingers in the cool water. "I needed this more than I realized. To get out of town, to see that there's more to this place than mining camps and saloons." "There's a lot more," Dalton agreed. "You just have to know where to look." They sat in companionable silence for a while, and Naomi felt some of the tension she'd been carrying since the letter arrived begin to ease. She glanced at Dalton and found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "What is it?" she asked. "I was just thinking that you're very brave," he said. "Coming out here alone, making a life in a place like Jerome, handling loss with such grace." "I don't feel brave," Naomi said. "Most of the time, I feel terrified." "That's what bravery is," Dalton said. "Doing what needs to be done even when you're scared." Something in his voice made her ask, "Were you scared when you left Texas?" "Terrified," he admitted. "I was 22 and had never been more than 50 miles from the ranch where I was born. Suddenly I was alone in a strange land with nothing but a horse and a saddle and $50 in my pocket. There were nights I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life." "What changed?" "I did," Dalton said. "I realized that home isn't a place, it's a feeling. It's where you find people who matter to you and work that gives you purpose, and moments of beauty like this." He gestured at the waterfall. "You can build that anywhere, if you're willing to try." Naomi felt tears prick her eyes again, but they were different from the tears of grief she'd cried before. These felt almost hopeful. "I want to believe that." "Then believe it," Dalton said. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "And let me help you build it if you'll have me." It was a declaration of intent, clear and unmistakable. Naomi knew she should probably be cautious, should protect her already bruised heart. But looking at Dalton in the dappled shade by the waterfall, She found she didn't want to be cautious. She wanted to take the risk. "I'd like that," she said quietly. Dalton's smile was like sunrise, slow and warm and illuminating. He lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles, a gesture that was both old-fashioned and sweet, and Naomi felt something crack open in her chest, letting light into places that had been dark with grief. They rode back to Jerome in the afternoon heat, but Naomi barely noticed the temperature. She felt alive in a way she hadn't since leaving Boston, maybe longer than that. Dalton talked about the ranch, about the cattle and horses and the other men who worked there. He told her about his boss, Robert Radcliffe, who'd given him a chance when he was just a green kid from Texas. He painted a picture of a life that was hard but honest, full of work and friendship and purpose. When they reached Jerome and Dalton helped her dismount at the bottom of her stairs, he said, "Can I see you again next Saturday?" "I'd like that," Naomi said. Then, feeling bold, she added, "But that's a whole week away." Dalton grinned. "It is. What if I came to town Wednesday evening? We could have dinner at Mrs. Alvarez's place." "I'll be there," Naomi promised. She watched him ride away, leading Penny back down the mountain, and climbed her stairs with a feeling in her chest that was almost like happiness. The grief was still there, the loss of her family and her old life, but it shared space now with something else, something bright and new and full of possibility. The next days passed more quickly than the previous week had. Naomi threw herself into her teaching with renewed energy, finding satisfaction in her students' progress. She wrote a letter to her aunt, acknowledging the news about her father and thanking her for informing her, but making it clear that she was building a life in Arizona and wouldn't be returning east. She cleaned her small room thoroughly, bought a few wildflowers from a Mexican woman selling them on the street, and put them in a tin cup on her windowsill. Wednesday evening arrived, and Naomi changed into her best dress, a deep green that brought out the color of her eyes. She met Dalton at the cafe, and they lingered over a meal of chicken and rice and vegetables, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about a difficult horse he was training, and she told him about a student who'd finally learned to read a whole page without help. Simple things, daily things, but the sharing of them felt intimate and important. When he walked her home afterward, the evening was soft and warm, the sky turning purple and orange over the mountains. At the bottom of her stairs, Dalton said, "I have something to tell you, and I don't want you to think I'm moving too fast, but I also don't believe in playing games." Naomi's heart began to race. "What is it?" "I like you, Naomi," he said, using her first name for the first time. "More than just as a friend. I know we haven't known each other long, but out here life's too short and too hard to waste time pretending. I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing." Naomi's breath caught. It was sudden, perhaps, but he was right that life was short. She'd learned that lesson harshly with the loss of her parents. And she liked him too, more than she'd allowed herself to admit. "I'm willing," she said. "I'd like that very much, Dalton." He reached out and cupped her cheek with his hand, his thumb brushing against her cheekbone. "Can I kiss you?" "Yes," she whispered. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but she didn't want to. When his lips met hers, gentle and warm, she felt something in her chest unfurl like a flower opening to the sun. The kiss was sweet and careful, full of promise rather than demand, and when they parted, Naomi felt dizzy with the rightness of it. "Good night, Naomi," Dalton said softly. "Good night," she replied, and climbed the stairs to her room feeling like she was floating. The weeks that followed established a pattern. Dalton came to town twice a week, on Wednesday evenings and Saturday mornings. They shared meals, took walks outside town when the weather allowed, and talked endlessly about their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Naomi learned that Dalton wanted to have his own ranch someday, that he loved the land and the work but dreamed of building something permanent. He learned that she'd always loved teaching, that books were her refuge, that she'd come west partly to escape a future that felt too constrained and conventional. They kissed again, and then again, each time a little less carefully and a little more passionately. Dalton was always respectful, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. But the attraction between them grew stronger with each meeting. Naomi found herself thinking about him constantly, counting the days until she'd see him again. The other miners and townsfolk noticed, of course. Jerome was too small for anything to go unnoticed. Mrs. Alvarez beamed at them every time they came into the cafe. Mr. Patterson made knowing comments when Dalton came into the general store. Some of the miners made cruder observations, but Dalton's reputation as a man who could handle himself kept most of the comments to a minimum. September arrived, bringing slightly cooler temperatures and the beginning of the school term proper. Naomi had more students now that the summer heat had broken, and she threw herself into her work with passion. But her real joy came from the time she spent with Dalton, watching him become more than just a friend or a suitor. He was becoming essential to her, the person she wanted to share everything with. One Saturday in late September, Dalton took her to meet his boss at the Double R Ranch. Robert Radcliffe was a gruff man in his 50s who'd built his ranch from nothing and had little patience for fools. But he treated Naomi with respect and told Dalton later that he'd made a good choice, which Dalton reported to her with obvious pride. "He liked you," Dalton said, as they rode back toward Jerome in the late afternoon. "That's not easy to accomplish. Robert doesn't like many people." "I liked him too," Naomi said, "and the ranch is beautiful." "Would you want to live on a ranch?" Dalton asked, and there was something significant in the question. Naomi looked at him carefully. "Are you asking me hypothetically or specifically?" Dalton reined in his horse, and Naomi stopped Penny beside him. They were on a rise overlooking the valley, Jerome visible as a cluster of buildings on the mountain above them, the Double R spread out below. "Specifically," Dalton said, "Naomi, I know we've only been courting a few months, but I'm 27 years old, and I know my own mind. I love you. I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you, whether that's here in Arizona or somewhere else, on a ranch or in a town, whatever makes you happy." Naomi's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears this time, joyful tears. "I love you too," she said. "I didn't think I could feel this way again, not after everything I lost, but you've given me hope and happiness and a future I actually want." "Is that a yes?" Dalton asked, his voice rough with emotion. "That's a yes," Naomi said, laughing and crying at the same time. Dalton dismounted and lifted her down from Penny, pulling her into his arms and kissing her with a passion that made her dizzy. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he said, "I'll get you a proper ring. We'll do this right." "I don't need a ring," Naomi said. "I just need you." "You'll have both," Dalton promised. They rode back to Jerome as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose, and Naomi felt like she was riding towards something rather than away from it for the first time since leaving Boston. The future had seemed so bleak when she'd read that letter back in August, but now it shimmered with possibility. Dalton stayed in town that night, taking a room at the boarding house so they could tell people their news the next day. They went to church together Sunday morning. A small congregation that met in what had been a warehouse, and afterward announced their engagement to the gathered townsfolk. Mrs. Alvarez cried and hugged them both. Mr. Patterson shook Dalton's hand and told him he was a lucky man. Even the rough miners offered congratulations, and Naomi felt for the first time like she might actually belong in this strange mountain town. They planned a simple wedding for early November, giving them enough time to prepare, but not so long that they had to wait forever. Naomi continued teaching, though she knew she'd have to give it up when she married and moved to the ranch. She felt a pang about that, but Dalton suggested she might teach the ranch children in the area, and the idea of creating a small school in the valley excited her. Dalton appeared in town one Wednesday with a ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet that had belonged to his grandmother. He slipped it onto her finger behind the general store where they had a moment of privacy, and Naomi treasured it more than any expensive diamond. The weeks before the wedding were busy but joyful. Mrs. Alvarez helped Naomi sew a wedding dress, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Dalton arranged for the ranch foreman to perform the ceremony, as he was a lay preacher. Robert Radcliffe offered to host the wedding breakfast at the ranch house, a generosity that touched them both. Naomi found herself thinking often about her parents during this time, wishing they could be there to see her marry, but the grief had softened from a sharp pain to a dull ache. She carried them with her in memory, and she knew they would have loved Dalton, would have been happy to see her building a life full of love and purpose. The night before the wedding, Naomi took out the letter that had started everything, the one she'd been crying over when Dalton first approached her. She read it one last time, acknowledging the loss and the pain, then carefully burned it in the small stove in her room. The past was gone, but the future stretched ahead, bright and full of promise. The morning of November 3rd dawned clear and cool. Naomi dressed carefully in her new white dress, her hair arranged in a simple style with a few wildflowers tucked into the pins. Mrs. Alvarez and 2 other women from town helped her, fussing over her until she looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. She looked happy, she realized. Truly happy. They rode to the ranch in a wagon Robert had sent, and Naomi's breath caught when she saw the ranch house decorated with ribbons and more wildflowers. A crowd had gathered, ranch hands and their families, townsfolk who'd made the journey down from Jerome, even a few neighboring ranchers Robert had invited. And there was Dalton, standing near the house in a new shirt and vest, his hair neatly combed, his eyes shining when he saw her. Naomi climbed down from the wagon and walked toward him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. The ceremony was simple and sincere. They stood under the vast Arizona sky and spoke vows that promised love, faithfulness, partnership through whatever came. When the foreman pronounced them married and Dalton kissed her, the crowd cheered and Naomi felt like everything she'd lost and everything she'd suffered had led her to exactly this moment, this man, this life. The breakfast was a lively affair with food and music and dancing. Naomi was passed from one partner to another as the ranch hands insisted on dancing with the bride, but her eyes always found Dalton across the crowd, and his found hers, and every look was a promise of the night to come and all the nights after. As the sun began to set, they slipped away to the small cabin Robert had offered them for their wedding night, a place at the edge of the ranch property near a grove of cottonwoods. Someone had stocked it with food and firewood and made up the bed with clean linens and a quilt. Dalton carried Naomi over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the middle of the single room. The door closed behind them, shutting out the world, leaving just the 2 of them in the gathering twilight. "Hello, wife," Dalton said softly, his hands coming up to cup her face. "Hello, husband," Naomi replied, and the word felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. They came together slowly, unpinning her hair, unbuttoning his vest, each gesture an act of discovery and promise. When they finally lay together in the narrow bed, Naomi felt nervous and excited and overwhelmingly grateful for this man who'd held her while she cried and never asked for anything in return, who'd given her everything anyway. Their joining was sweet and awkward and tender, full of whispered reassurances and gentle touches. Afterward, they lay tangled together, skin against skin, and Naomi felt more at peace than she had in years. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Dalton replied, his arms tightening around her. "Always. No matter what comes." They spent 3 days in the cabin, a brief honeymoon where they learned each other's bodies and habits and morning rhythms. Then they moved into the small house on the ranch property that Robert had offered them as part of Dalton's wages, a 2-room place that was simple but sturdy, with windows that looked out over the valley and a porch where they could sit in the evenings. Naomi threw herself into making it a home, hanging curtains she'd sewn, arranging the furniture they'd acquired, planting a small garden even though it was late in the season. Dalton worked long days with the cattle, coming home dusty and tired, but always with a smile for her, always with stories about his day that made her feel included in this new life. She started teaching the ranch children in the mornings, just 3 students at first, but growing as word spread. She held classes in the main room of their little house, and Dalton built her a proper bookshelf for the few books she'd brought from Boston and the ones they slowly acquired. The first months of marriage were an adjustment. They had disagreements about small things, learning to navigate sharing space and decisions, but they talked through everything, committed to honesty and respect, and each conflict resolved brought them closer. Winter came to the Arizona high country. not as harsh as Boston winters, but cold enough, with occasional snow that dusted the red rocks white. Naomi and Dalton spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other, playing cards, talking about their dreams for the future. "I want to save up enough to buy land," Dalton told her one night, as they lay in bed listening to wind rattle the windows. "Start our own ranch, something we can build together and leave to our children someday." "Children," Naomi repeated, her hand going instinctively to her still flat stomach. "How many children do you want?" "As many as we're blessed with," Dalton said. 3 or 4, maybe, a houseful. What about you?" "I'd like that," Naomi said. "I was an only child until my brother was born, and it was lonely. I want our children to have siblings, to have family." "They will," Dalton promised. "We'll build something lasting, Naomi, something that matters." By spring, Naomi knew she was pregnant. The realization came with joy and terror in equal measure. She'd heard the stories about childbirth, especially in remote areas far from doctors, but when she told Dalton, his joy was so pure and overwhelming that her fears receded. "We're going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "Naomi, we're going to have a baby." He became even more protective, insisting she rest more, do less, though she laughed and told him she wasn't an invalid. But his care was sweet, and she loved him more for his concern. The pregnancy progressed without major complications, though the summer heat was difficult and Naomi felt ungainly and uncomfortable in the later months. The ranch women rallied around her, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and reassurance. Mrs. Alvarez came down from Jerome with supplies and wisdom, promising to be there for the birth. In late September, almost exactly a year after Dalton had proposed, Naomi went into labor. It was long and difficult and painful in ways she hadn't imagined, but Dalton stayed with her the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragement. Mrs. Alvarez delivered the baby with practiced competence, and when the baby's cry finally filled the room, Naomi wept with relief and joy. "A boy," Mrs. Alvarez announced, placing the squirming, wailing bundle on Naomi's chest. "A healthy, strong boy." Dalton leaned over them both, his face wet with tears, his hand gentle on his son's tiny head. "He's perfect," he breathed. "Naomi, he's perfect." They named him Thomas after Naomi's brother, and James after Dalton's father. Little Thomas had dark hair like his father and gray-green eyes and lungs that could wake the entire ranch. Naomi fell in love with him instantly, completely, a fierce, protective love that consumed her. The first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful. Naomi survived on broken sleep and moments of transcendent joy when Thomas smiled or made a new sound or did anything at all. Dalton was a devoted father, walking the floor with the baby at night, changing diapers without complaint, staring at his son with an expression of awe. "I can't believe we made him," Dalton said one evening, holding Thomas while the baby slept against his chest. "That he's ours." "He's a miracle," Naomi agreed, watching them together, her heart almost too full. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. They saved money carefully, and Dalton worked extra jobs when he could, always with an eye toward buying their own land. Naomi taught her small school and raised Thomas, and slowly became a true member of the ranch community, valued for her education and her kindness. When Thomas was 2, Naomi became pregnant again. This time she felt more confident, knowing what to expect, though the labor was no easier. But in the spring of 1886, they welcomed a daughter, whom they named Margaret Rose after both their mothers. She had Naomi's coloring and Dalton's determination, and Thomas was instantly fascinated by his baby sister. Life settled into a rhythm of work and family and slow progress toward their dreams. Dalton proved himself invaluable to Robert Radcliffe, and when Robert's health began to fail in the late 1880s, he offered to sell Dalton a portion of the ranch on generous terms. It took all their savings and a loan from the bank in Prescott, but in 1889 they became landowners, with 300 acres of valley land, and a small herd of cattle to start. They built a new house together, larger than the cabin they'd lived in, with 3 bedrooms and a real kitchen and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Naomi planted a garden and fruit trees. Dalton built a barn and corrals. Thomas, now 6, helped with everything, proud to be working beside his father. Margaret toddled around getting into everything, bright and curious and fearless. Naomi sometimes thought about that day in August 1882 when she'd stood on the Jerome boardwalk crying over a letter that contained nothing but loss. It felt like a lifetime ago, like it had happened to a different person, that Naomi had been alone and frightened and grieving. This Naomi had a husband she loved deeply, children who filled her days with purpose and joy, land she could call home, and a future that stretched ahead full of possibility. A 3rd child arrived in 1890, another son they named William, and then a 4th in 1893, a daughter named Catherine. Their house was full and loud and chaotic and perfect. Naomi's small school grew to include a dozen children from surrounding ranches, and Dalton became known throughout the valley as a fair and hard-working rancher. They faced difficulties, of course. There were droughts that tested their resources and cattle diseases that decimated the herd in years when money was desperately tight. But they faced everything together, partners in the truest sense, and somehow they always found a way through. On their 10th anniversary in November 1893, Dalton took Naomi back to the waterfall, where he'd first told her about building home wherever you found beauty and people who mattered. They rode together, leaving the children with a neighboring family, stealing a rare day alone. The waterfall looked just as it had that first day, a hidden oasis in the desert. They sat on the same flat rock, older now, worn by work and parenthood, but happy in a deep, abiding way. "Do you remember what I told you here?" Dalton asked, taking her hand. "You told me home was a feeling, not a place," Naomi said, "that you could build it anywhere." "I was right," Dalton said. "Home is wherever you are, Naomi, you and our children. That's all I need." "I feel the same way," Naomi said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was so lost when I met you. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered, but I'd really just lost the past. You gave me a future." "We gave each other a future," Dalton corrected. "Everything we've built, we built together." They sat in the late autumn sunshine, holding hands, listening to the water fall, and Naomi felt grateful for every moment that had led her here. The grief she'd carried for her parents had gentled into a soft sadness mixed with love, and she'd told their children stories about the grandparents they'd never met, keeping those memories alive. She thought about the cowboy who'd seen her crying and hadn't asked what the letter said, who'd simply offered comfort and presence and steadiness, who'd held her while she fell apart and helped her build herself back together, stronger and braver than before. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For that day in Jerome, for not asking questions, for just being there when I needed someone, even though you didn't know me, for everything that came after." Dalton lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles, just like he had that first day by this waterfall. "Best decision I ever made, walking up to you on that boardwalk. Changed my whole life." "Changed mine too," Naomi said. They rode home as the sun set, back to their ranch, their children, their life. Thomas and Margaret ran out to meet them, full of stories about their day. William toddled behind them, and Catherine was in the arms of the neighbor woman who'd been watching them. The house glowed with lamplight, warm and welcoming. Dalton helped Naomi down from her horse and kissed her there in the yard, surrounded by their children's laughter and the evening sounds of the ranch. And Naomi thought about how much can change in a decade, how loss can transform into love, how a letter with no good news can lead to the best thing that ever happened. The years continued their steady march. The ranch prospered slowly but surely. Their children grew, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Thomas became a skilled horseman who talked about studying veterinary medicine. Margaret showed a gift for teaching and would sometimes lead Naomi's classes. William was quiet and artistic, always drawing or carving wood. Catherine was the wild one, fearless and full of joy. In 1896, Naomi became pregnant for the fifth time at 37. The pregnancy was harder than the previous ones, and the birth of their last child, a son they named Daniel, was difficult enough that the doctor they'd brought from Prescott told them firmly there should be no more children. Naomi agreed, relieved and grateful that they'd all survived. Daniel was an easy baby, content and smiley, and his older siblings doted on him. The house was bursting at the seams with 5 children, and Dalton began planning an addition, more bedrooms and a larger gathering space. They'd become pillars of the small community that had grown up in the Verde Valley. Dalton served on the board that managed the irrigation systems, and Naomi's school was now formal enough that she received a small salary from the territorial government. They attended church services, helped neighbors in need, hosted gatherings on their porch in the summer evenings. Naomi sometimes encountered people from Jerome when she went to town for supplies, and they'd comment on how much she'd changed, how she'd blossomed in her years on the ranch. She always smiled and agreed, though privately she thought she hadn't changed so much as become more fully herself, free from the constraints of her Boston upbringing and the loneliness of her first months in Arizona. The turn of the century came with celebration and optimism. They gathered the whole family for a photograph, one of the first taken with the new camera the Valley's shopkeeper had acquired. In it, Dalton stands behind Naomi, his hands on her shoulders, both of them surrounded by their 5 children. Everyone is dressed in their best clothes, serious for the camera, but you can see the happiness in their eyes, the contentment. Naomi had that photograph framed and hung it in their parlor, and she looked at it often in the years that followed, marveling at the life she'd built from the ashes of loss. Thomas left for university in 1900 to study animal medicine, the first of their children to pursue higher education. Naomi cried when he left, but was fiercely proud. Margaret followed 2 years later, attending normal school to become a certified teacher. The house felt emptier without them, but William and Catherine and Daniel kept it lively, and Thomas and Margaret came home for summers. Dalton's hair was going gray at the temples now, and Naomi saw lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they married. But she loved his older face as much as she'd loved his younger one. They'd grown into middle age together, partners who still held hands on the porch in the evenings, who still kissed goodnight, who still found joy in each other after 20 years of marriage. "Do you ever regret it?" Dalton asked her one evening as they watched the sunset paint the valley gold. "Giving up the life you could have had in the East? You could have remarried there? Someone educated and wealthy, lived in a city with culture and society?" "Not for a single moment," Naomi said firmly. "This life with you, it's everything I ever wanted. I just didn't know it until I found it." "Me too," Dalton said. He pulled her closer against his side. "Me too." In 1903, Robert Radcliffe passed away peacefully in his sleep, leaving the remainder of his ranch to Dalton, who'd become like a son to him. It was an unexpected inheritance that tripled their land holdings and made them one of the larger ranches in the valley. Dalton took the responsibility seriously, working harder than ever to honor Robert's memory by running the ranch well. Thomas graduated and came home to practice veterinary medicine throughout the valley, building a small clinic on their land. Margaret accepted a teaching position in Prescott but visited often. William surprised everyone by announcing he wanted to study architecture in Chicago, and they scraped together the money to send him, wanting to support his dreams even though it meant he'd be far from home. Catherine, at 15, was already drawing male attention, though Dalton grumbled about it constantly. Daniel, still a boy of 7, was happiest following his father around the ranch, learning everything he could about cattle and horses and land management. The century's first decade brought both progress and challenges. Automobiles began to appear on the roads, though Dalton distrusted them and stuck with horses. The telephone lines reached the valley, and they had one installed in their house, a marvel that let Naomi speak to Margaret in Prescott without traveling. Arizona moved closer to statehood, and Dalton attended meetings about what that would mean for the territory. Their 25th anniversary in 1908 was celebrated with a party that included over 100 people, neighbors and friends from throughout the valley, and even some folks who traveled down from Jerome. It was a testament to how much they were loved and respected, how thoroughly they'd woven themselves into the fabric of the community. Standing in the middle of their packed house, Naomi looked around at the life they'd built and felt overwhelming gratitude. Her children, mostly grown now, healthy and pursuing their own dreams. Her husband, gray-haired but still strong, laughing with neighbors. Her home, comfortable and full of love. Her work, teaching a new generation of Valley children. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, Naomi and Dalton lay in their bed and talked about the past quarter century. 25 years, Dalton marveled. Feels like both forever and no time at all. I know what you mean, Naomi said. She turned to face him in the darkness. I'm so grateful, Dalton, for everything, for you approaching me that day when I was crying, for being patient with me, for building this life with me. Best thing I ever did, Dalton said, pulling her close. Love you, Naomi, always have, always will. I love you too, she whispered against his chest, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The years flowed on. Catherine married a young rancher from a neighboring property in 1912, a good man who Dalton approved of after thorough investigation. The wedding was joyous, and Naomi cried happy tears watching her daughter dance with her new husband. Daniel grew into a tall, serious young man who announced his intention to run the ranch when Dalton was ready to step back. It was a relief to know the land they'd worked so hard for would stay in the family. Thomas married a school teacher from Prescott in 1914, and they built a house near his clinic. Margaret, to everyone's surprise, announced her engagement to a lawyer from Phoenix, and they planned a wedding for the following year. William returned from Chicago with a degree and immediately began designing houses throughout Arizona, his modern ideas sometimes clashing with traditional preferences, but eventually winning people over with their practicality and beauty. The Great War in Europe seemed far away at first, but when America entered in 1917, Thomas enlisted as a military veterinarian. It was terrifying for Naomi watching her eldest son go off to war, but she was also proud of his service. He returned in 1919 thinner and quieter but whole, and threw himself back into his work with renewed dedication. Arizona had gained statehood in 1912, and Dalton joked that they'd helped settle the state, that their children were true Arizona natives in a way he and Naomi could never be. It was true in a sense. Their children had been shaped by this land, knew no other home, and were building their own lives in the valleys and towns of the state. In 1922, 30 years after their wedding, Dalton and Naomi took another trip to the waterfall. It was harder to get there now, both of them in their 60s, but they managed it with determination and occasional laughter at their own creaking joints. The waterfall was still there, unchanged while they'd aged. They sat on their rock and held hands looking at the water. 30 years, Naomi said, 3 decades, 5 children, a ranch, a life. No regrets? Dalton asked. The same question he'd asked before. Not a single one, Naomi confirmed. You? Only that we didn't meet sooner, Dalton said. That we couldn't have had even more years together. We'll have more yet, Naomi said. We're not done. No, Dalton agreed. We're not done. They were blessed with grandchildren starting in the early 1920s. Catherine had 3, Thomas had 2, Margaret had 4, William had 1, and Daniel, who married in 1925, began his own family. The ranch house, which had once been so full of their own children, began filling with grandchildren who came for summer visits and holidays. Naomi loved being a grandmother, loved the way the children saw her as a source of stories and cookies and unconditional love. She told them about their grandfather back in Boston, about their grandmother, about the long journey west, about the early days in Jerome and the ranch. Dalton became the family patriarch, respected and beloved. His word still law when it needed to be, but mostly just a source of wisdom and terrible jokes that made the grandchildren laugh. They watched their children become parents themselves, watch grandchildren grow from babies to children to teenagers, watch the ranch prosper and grow, watch the valley change and modernize while still retaining something essential about its character. In 1932, their 40th anniversary, they were too old to ride to the waterfall, So their children and grandchildren brought the waterfall to them, decorating the ranch house with wildflowers and ribbons, setting up tables on the porch, gathering the whole extended family for a celebration. There was a new photograph taken that day, much larger than the one from 1900. Dalton and Naomi sat in the center, gray-haired and wrinkled, but still holding hands, surrounded by their 5 children, their children's spouses, and 14 grandchildren of various ages. It took several tries to get everyone looking at the camera at the same time, and the result was chaos, but it was beautiful chaos. That night, exhausted but happy, Naomi and Dalton sat on their porch in the chairs they'd occupied for 40 years, watching the stars come out over the valley. 40 years, Dalton said wonderingly. How did that happen? One day at a time, Naomi said, one sunrise, one sunset, one moment after another. Best 40 years of my life, Dalton said. Mine too, Naomi agreed, even though they started with me crying over a letter that said I'd lost everything. You hadn't lost everything, Dalton said. You just lost everything you'd known, but you had yourself still. Your strength, your courage, your capacity to love. That's what built all of this. We built it together, Naomi insisted, just as he'd insisted all those years ago. Everything good in my life came from you approaching me that day, from you holding me without demanding explanations, from you seeing me when I felt invisible. I'll always see you, Dalton said. He reached for her hand, his grip not as strong as it once was, but still warm, still steady. Always, Naomi, until my last breath. And I'll always see you, Naomi promised. They sat together in the darkness, 2 people who'd found each other in the midst of loss and grief and had built something beautiful and lasting. The valley spread out before them, dotted with lights from ranch houses, including several belonging to their own children. The land they'd worked was productive and would support future generations. The family they'd created was strong and loving, rooted in the values they'd tried to instill. It was a good life, Naomi thought. A very good life indeed. Dalton passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1935 at the age of 76. He'd worked a full day on the ranch, eaten dinner with Naomi, sat on the porch watching the sunset, kissed her goodnight, and simply didn't wake up the next morning. The doctor said his heart had given out, that he'd lived a long and full life, that there was nothing anyone could have done. Naomi was devastated, but also grateful that he'd gone peacefully, without suffering, still strong and active until the very end. The funeral was enormous. People coming from all over the state to pay their respects to a man who'd been respected and loved by everyone who knew him. She stood at his grave, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, and thought about the cowboy who'd approached a crying woman on a Jerome boardwalk 53 years earlier, who'd offered comfort without asking for anything in return, who'd given her everything anyway: love, partnership, family, home, purpose, joy. Thank you, she whispered to the wind. Thank you for every single day. Naomi lived another 7 years, moving into a smaller house on the ranch property that Thomas built for her, letting Daniel take over the main house with his family. She spent her days with her grandchildren, teaching those who wanted to learn, telling stories about the old days, tending a small garden, reading books, writing letters. She passed away in her sleep in the summer of 1942 at the age of 83, in the house her son had built for her on the land she and Dalton had worked together. Her children found her in the morning looking peaceful, a slight smile on her face, and they liked to think she'd been dreaming of Dalton, of being young again, of riding together through the Verde Valley toward a future full of promise. They buried her next to Dalton under a cottonwood tree on a rise overlooking the ranch, with headstones that bore their names and dates, and a simple inscription: "Together, always." The ranch continued through the generations. Daniel's children took it over, and then his grandchildren. Thomas's veterinary practice became a family business. Margaret's children became teachers. William's children became architects. Catherine's children stayed in ranching. The family tree spread and branched, and all of them carried forward the story of their grandparents who'd met in Jerome, Arizona in 1882, who'd built something lasting from loss and love. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the desert air was soft and the stars blazed overhead, people swore they could see two figures on the porch of the old ranch house, sitting close together, holding hands, watching the sun set over the valley they'd made home. Whether it was memory or imagination or something more, it was a reminder that love, real love, the kind built on respect and partnership and shared dreams, that kind of love never really ends. It just transforms, becomes part of the land itself, the stories we tell, the lives we build on the foundations laid by those who came before. The cowboy had held a crying woman and hadn't asked what the letter said, and from that single act of kindness had grown a love story that spanned 53 years, that produced 5 children and 14 grandchildren and countless great-grandchildren, that built a ranch and a legacy and a family that would endure for generations. It was the kind of love story the West was built on, practical and passionate in equal measure, full of hard work and harder times, but also joy and laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful together. It was a story about loss transformed into love, about grief giving way to hope, about two people who found each other exactly when they needed each other most and built a life that mattered. And that, in the end, was all anyone could ask for. A life that mattered, shared with someone who made every sunrise worth seeing and every sunset worth savoring, who held you when you cried and celebrated when you laughed and stood beside you through everything the world threw your way. Dalton and Naomi had that, and they'd made sure their children had it and their children's children, creating ripples that would extend far into a future they'd never see, but had helped shape through the choices they made and the love they shared. The waterfall still flows in that hidden canyon in the Verde Valley, unchanged by the passage of time, waiting for other lost souls to find it and find hope. The ranch still operates, run now by the 5th generation of the family that Dalton and Naomi started. Jerome still clings to its mountain, though it's more of a tourist attraction now than a working mining town. And somewhere in the records of the small church that used to meet in an old warehouse, there's a marriage certificate dated November 3rd, 1883, bearing 2 names and a promise that was kept faithfully until death, and perhaps even beyond. That's the story of a cowboy and a school teacher, of a letter with no good news and a man who offered comfort without asking questions, of love found in the most unlikely of places and built into something that would last forever. It's a story of the West as it really was, not just cowboys and outlaws, but ordinary people building extraordinary lives through perseverance and partnership and love. And it's a story that deserves to be remembered, to be told and retold, because it reminds us that even in our darkest moments, even when we're crying over news that feels like the end of everything, sometimes exactly the right person comes along at exactly the right moment and changes everything in the best possible way. Naomi never forgot that day on the Jerome Boardwalk, and she made sure her children and grandchildren knew the story, knew that their family started with an act of simple kindness between strangers who became everything to each other. And they passed that story on, and it became part of the family mythology, the foundational tale that explained who they were and where they came from and why they valued kindness and courage and love above all else. Because in the end, that's what matters. Not wealth or status or even longevity, but love. The real, deep, abiding kind that sees you at your worst and stays anyway, that builds with you instead of for you, that transforms ordinary days into extraordinary lives simply by being there, constant and true. Dalton and Naomi had that kind of love, and it made all the difference.